The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the observation deck of the assembly cruiser Halvanar, and every officer around me froze at their stations. I was reading a routine supply report when the signal came through, and within 3 seconds that report no longer mattered. A colony on the edge of the Varen expanse was under attack. Not a skirmish, not a border dispute. A full assault by an unregistered military force that had ignored every treaty line the Assembly had drawn for the last 200 years. The colony belonged to a small, quiet species called the Doran, farmers and traders who had never raised a weapon against anyone. They were not members of the Assembly. They were not protected by any formal accord. They were simply people, living their lives, when ships appeared in their sky and began tearing their settlements apart. My name is Ellen Marsh, and at the time I held the rank of Senior Liaison Officer aboard the Halvanar, part of the Assembly's diplomatic fleet. We were not a war fleet. We carried translators, negotiators, and enough armament to defend ourselves if provoked, but nothing more. Our purpose was to observe, to mediate, to file reports that would eventually reach the Assembly Council, who would then debate for weeks or months before authorizing any kind of response. That was the process. That had always been the process. Slow, careful, deliberate. It had kept the peace for centuries by making sure no single species acted without consensus. I had believed in that process my entire career. The captain of the Halvanar, a broad-shouldered Vantic elder named Dos Kellamar, ordered us to full alert and set a course toward the Varen expanse. It would take us 6 hours to arrive, 6 hours during which the Doran colony would either survive or be erased. I remember standing at my console, watching the tactical display update every few minutes with fresh reports pulled from surviving Doran transmissions. Buildings collapsing, fields burning, voices pleading for anyone to come and help. I sent the distress call up the chain, as protocol demanded. I flagged it urgent. I attached everything I had, and then I waited, because that was my job. Wait for authorization. Wait for consensus. Wait for someone with more authority than me to decide that innocent people were worth saving. It was during that waiting period that something appeared on our long-range scanners that made every technician on the bridge go silent. A single ship had entered the Varen expanse from a completely different heading than our own. It was moving faster than anything in the Assembly's registered fleet inventory, and it was heading straight for the coordinates of the attack. No flight plan had been filed. No request for clearance had been submitted. It simply appeared, changed course, and accelerated toward the one place in the galaxy that mattered most in that moment. Captain Kellamar leaned over the sensor station, his 4 eyes narrowing at the readout. "Fum, identify that vessel," he said. The sensor officer, a young Doran refugee assistant named Priya Okafor, who had been assigned to our ship as a cultural advisor, worked her console with quick fingers. Her hands were shaking, though I did not know if it was from fear for her people or something else entirely. "It is registering as a human vessel," she said. "Independent registry, not part of any Assembly task force. Designation reads as the Ashford Vale." The bridge went quiet in a way I had never experienced before. I had heard of humans, of course. Everyone in the Assembly had. They were the newest species to be granted provisional membership, inducted less than a decade earlier, after a long and cautious evaluation process. Most delegates considered them promising but unpredictable, young, emotional, prone to acting on instinct rather than consensus. There had been entire committees formed just to study how to manage their behavior within Assembly structures, because unlike every other species who joined, humans did not seem to wait for permission before doing what they believed was right. "That is not one of our assigned response vessels," Captain Kellamar said slowly. "Confirm they were dispatched by Assembly Command." Priya checked, her eyes scanning rapidly across data feeds. "Negative, Captain. There is no dispatch order. No authorization request. They just left." According to the timestamp, they departed their patrol route 11 minutes after the first distress signal reached general frequency channels. 11 minutes. It had taken the Assembly Council over 4 hours just to schedule an emergency session to discuss whether a response was warranted. This ship had made its decision in the time it took most delegates to finish their morning correspondence. I felt something strange in my chest as I stared at that small blip on the display, racing ahead of our much larger fleet formation. It was not fear, not yet. It was something closer to disbelief. An entire process built over centuries, designed specifically to prevent any single actor from making unilateral military decisions, and one uninvited ship had simply ignored all of it. Should we hail them? I asked, because it seemed like the obvious diplomatic step. Establish contact, coordinate, bring them into the fold of assembly procedure before they did something that could not be undone. Captain Kellamar considered this for a long moment, his mandibles clicking together the way they did when he was thinking through consequences. Do it, he finally said. Politely, we do not know their intentions. I opened a channel myself, since as liaison officer that duty fell to me. The signal took a moment to connect, longer than it should have for a vessel that close. When the response came through, it was not video, only audio, and the voice that answered was calm, in a way that unsettled me more than shouting would have. This is Captain Owen Whitfield of the Ashford Vale. Go ahead, Halvanar. I introduced myself and explained our position, our fleet's estimated arrival time, and asked politely whether he intended to coordinate his approach with Assembly Command before engaging the situation at the colony. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. I received a distress call from civilians under attack, he said. I'm 3 hours closer than your fleet. I don't need authorization to answer someone screaming for help. I need coordinates, which I already have, and about 40 more minutes. I did not know how to respond to that. In assembly culture, in nearly every species I had studied across my career, the correct response to an emerging crisis was to gather information, convene the appropriate parties, and reach consensus on the best course of action before committing resources. It was how conflicts were kept from spiraling into wider wars. It was how mistakes were minimized. It was, I had always believed, the responsible way to conduct oneself when other lives were at stake. Captain Whitfield did not appear to share that belief. Sir, I said, choosing my words carefully, the Assembly strongly recommends coordinated engagement to avoid escalation. A single vessel acting independently could complicate the situation significantly. Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had not changed in tone, but something in the words carried a weight I had not expected. Ma'am, with respect, there are children down there right now, hiding in whatever shelter they can find, while their homes burn around them. I am not going to sit in open space, debating procedure while that continues. If your fleet wants to coordinate once you arrive, I will happily share tactical data. Until then, I'm going in. The channel closed. I sat back in my chair, staring at the display where the small human vessel continued its rapid approach toward the barren expanse. Priya Okafor, beside me, had tears forming at the corners of her eyes, though her expression was difficult to read. Relief, perhaps, or fear of what might happen next. Her people were down there, and for the first time since the attack began, someone was actually moving to help them, instead of debating whether help was warranted. Captain, I said, turning to Kellamar, should we attempt to slow him down? Order him to hold position until we arrive? Kellamar's 4 eyes fixed on the tactical display for a long moment before he answered. Do we have any legal authority to compel a provisional member species to stand down from an independent rescue action? I thought through everything I knew of assembly law, every regulation I had studied during my years of service. No, I admitted, not without a formal council order, which we do not have. Then, we have no grounds to stop him, Kellamar said. Increase our speed. I want eyes on that colony the moment we arrive, and I want to know exactly what a single human vessel intends to do against a force large enough to level an entire settlement. The bridge crew moved with renewed urgency, adjusting our course, pushing the Halvanar's engines to their limit, even though we both knew we would not arrive in time to influence whatever happened first. I kept my eyes on the small blip that represented the Ashford Vale, watching it pull further and further ahead of us on the display, alone, racing toward a fight that by every reasonable calculation, it should not have been able to win. I thought about the intelligence briefings I had read on the attacking force before we departed. They called themselves the Corveth Dominion, though no formal assembly record recognized that name. They were a splinter faction that had broken away from a larger interstellar power decades earlier, built around a doctrine that strength alone determined the right to territory. They had grown quietly for years, absorbing smaller unprotected populations, and the Doran colony was simply the latest target in a long pattern that the assembly had been slow to fully investigate. Estimates placed their assault force at no fewer than 18 vessels, ranging from light attack craft to at least 2 heavy cruisers capable of orbital bombardment. Against that, a single human vessel of unknown but presumably modest specifications was heading in completely alone. "Captain, should we send word to Assembly Command about this development?" I asked. "Already done," Kellamar said without looking away from his display. "For all the good it will do us in the next 40 minutes. I understood what he meant. Even if the Council convened an emergency session the moment they received our report, by the time any formal decision was reached, this would already be over, one way or another. For the first time in my career, I was witnessing something happen entirely outside the boundaries of the system I had trusted my whole professional life to protect the innocent. Priya leaned toward me quietly. "Do you think he can actually do anything?" she asked. "One ship against that many?" I did not have an honest answer that would comfort her, so I said nothing, and we both watched the display in silence as the minutes ticked past. 40 minutes, Captain Whitfield had said. I found myself counting them down internally, unable to look away from the console even when other duties called for my attention. The Ashford Vale's icon grew closer to the marked location of the Doran colony, with each passing moment, a single point of light approaching a cluster of larger, more numerous signatures that represented the Corvette assault fleet. I had spent my entire career believing that restraint, patience, and consensus were the tools that kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart. I had believed that unilateral action, no matter how well-intentioned, was inherently dangerous because it removed the checks that prevented catastrophic mistakes. But as I watched that single human ship close the distance toward an enemy force that outnumbered it many times over, moving with a certainty I had never witnessed in any diplomatic session or council debate, I felt the foundation of that belief begin to crack, though I did not yet understand how deeply. 38 minutes remained, until contact, according to the timestamp on our display. I did not know it then, but by the time those minutes had passed, everything I understood about how conflicts were supposed to unfold in this galaxy would be permanently rewritten in my mind, and the name Owen Whitfield would become one that every delegate in the assembly would learn to speak with a mixture of gratitude and quiet unease. For now, all I could do was watch, and wait, and wonder what kind of species sent a single ship into a fight that no reasonable calculation said it could win, without a single moment of hesitation. The Ashford Vale dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the very edge of the Varan expanse, close enough to see the Doran colony burning on our long-range sensors, but still minutes away from the heart of the conflict. I watched the tactical display update in real time as Priya translated the last few fragments of Doran distress chatter, still coming through on open channels. Most of it was no longer coordinated. It was just people, terrified, calling out for anyone who could hear them. Captain Kellamar ordered a full sensor sweep of the Corvette fleet the moment we had a clear line of sight, and what came back onto our screens made the bridge fall into a heavy, uneasy silence. 18 vessels confirmed, exactly as the earlier intelligence had suggested. 12 light attack craft moving in a loose perimeter around the colony, clearly meant to pick off anything trying to escape the surface. 4 mid-sized cruisers positioned to provide covering fire, and 2 heavy warships holding position in high orbit, their weapon signatures indicating they were capable of bombarding the surface directly, which explained the growing scars of destruction visible even from this distance. Against that, the Ashford Vale registered on our scanners as a single mid-sized vessel, roughly the size of one of the Corvette cruisers, though its weapon and shield signatures were difficult to fully classify. Human technology had only been shared with the assembly in limited amounts since their induction, and much of what they used remained unfamiliar to our analysts. "He is going to get himself killed," muttered one of the junior officers near the weapons station, a Talish engineer named Bora Wren who had been quietly watching the display with the rest of us. No one corrected him, because in that moment it seemed like the only reasonable conclusion. I opened a channel again, hoping to reach Captain Whitfield before he closed the remaining distance to the enemy formation. It connected almost instantly. "Captain Whitfield, this is Ellen Marsh again. Our sensors show the full scale of the force you are approaching. Please reconsider engaging alone. Our fleet will arrive within the hour. If you hold position and wait for us, we can coordinate a combined approach that gives everyone a far better chance of success." There was a brief pause before he answered, and this time I could hear something in the background of his ship, a low, steady hum of systems being brought online, calm and methodical, without any trace of panic. "I appreciate the offer, Marsh, but there are people down there who don't have an hour," he said. "Every minute I wait is a minute those ships spend finishing what they started. I've got a plan. It doesn't need a fleet behind it." "With respect, Captain, a plan against 18 ships is not the same as a viable plan," I said, unable to keep a note of urgency from creeping into my voice. "You are risking your life, and the lives of anyone still alive on that colony, if this goes wrong." "Then I'd better make sure it doesn't go wrong," he replied, and there was no bravado in the way he said it. No false confidence meant to reassure me. It was simply a statement of fact, as far as he was concerned. "I'll keep this channel open so your fleet can monitor. That's the best I can offer." The connection did not close this time, but he did not speak again either. I watched the display as the Ashford Vale began its final approach, and I realized with a growing unease that Captain Whitfield had not once asked us for reinforcements, tactical support, or even basic information about the enemy fleet's capabilities. He had already gathered everything he needed on his own, in the short time since receiving the original distress call, and he intended to act on it entirely by himself. "Captain Kellamar," I said, turning to him, "should we attempt to close the distance faster? Push the engines beyond safe parameters?" Kellamar considered this, his mandibles working slowly as he weighed the risk. Even at maximum overdrive, we would not reach the colony for at least 25 minutes. Whatever is about to happen will already be decided by then. I looked back at the display, at the small human vessel now entering weapons range of the outermost Corvette attack craft, and I felt a knot forming in my stomach that had nothing to do with professional detachment. I had watched conflicts unfold from a distance many times in my career, always as an observer, always confident that the process I served would eventually produce a fair and measured outcome. I had never watched something like this. A single ship walking directly into overwhelming odds with what appeared to be total certainty in its own success. The first exchange happened faster than I could process it. 3 of the Corvette light attack craft broke formation and moved to intercept the Ashford Vale the moment it entered engagement range, clearly expecting to overwhelm a single vessel through simple numbers. What happened instead defied every tactical model our analysts had prepared. The human ship did not attempt to evade or retreat. It moved directly into the gap between the 3 attackers, and in a sequence of maneuvers too precise to have been improvised, disabled all 3 within the span of perhaps 20 seconds. I want to be clear about what I mean by disabled. This was not destruction in the way I had feared. The human vessel's weapons appeared calibrated with surgical precision, targeting propulsion and weapons systems, rather than the ships themselves. Each of the 3 attack craft went dark on our sensors almost simultaneously, drifting now, powerless, but their life signature readings remained steady. Whoever was aboard those ships was alive. They simply could no longer fight. "That is not possible," Bora-Ren said quietly from the weapons station, staring at his readouts as if they might correct themselves. "No targeting system reacts that fast. No pilot reacts that fast." I did not have an explanation either, and neither did anyone else on the bridge. We simply watched as the Ashford Vale continued forward, and the remaining Corvette attack craft began to realize, far too late, that whatever they were facing was not going to behave the way any enemy they had encountered before had behaved. 6 more light attack craft moved to converge on the human vessel's position, clearly attempting to surround it and overwhelm it through concentrated fire from multiple angles. I found myself holding my breath, certain that this time the numbers would finally matter, that 6 ships firing simultaneously from different vectors could not possibly be evaded or countered by a single vessel. What I witnessed instead was something that I still find difficult to fully describe, even now, long after that day. The Ashford Vale's shields flared with each impact, visible even at this distance as brief flashes of light against the darkness of space, but the ship did not slow, did not retreat, and did not appear to sustain any damage that affected its performance. It moved through the formation of 6 attackers with the same precision it had shown against the first 3, disabling each ship in turn, methodically, without wasted motion, without a single shot that missed its intended target. "Their targeting is inhuman," Priya said quietly beside me, and then seemed to catch the strange irony of her own words, because a small, disbelieving laugh escaped her, despite the tension in the air. Within 4 minutes of first engagement, 9 of the 12 light attack craft had been disabled, their crews alive, but their ships rendered useless. The remaining 3 broke formation entirely and attempted to retreat toward the heavier cruisers, clearly recognizing that whatever tactical doctrine they had trained under offered no answer to what they were facing. The 4 mid-sized corvette cruisers, which had been holding position to provide covering fire, finally moved to engage directly, their combined weapons output far exceeding anything the light attack craft could have brought to bear. I braced myself, certain that this would be the moment the human vessel's luck, or skill, or whatever combination of the two had carried it this far, would finally run out. Captain Whitfield's voice came through the still open channel, calm and unhurried, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than engaging 4 warships simultaneously. Fleet Command, be advised. I am altering approach vector to draw fire away from the colony's surface. Recommend your fleet prepare to receive any craft attempting to flee the engagement zone. Captain Kellamar, to his credit, did not hesitate. Understood. Ashford Vale. We are adjusting our approach to intercept any fleeing vessels. I stared at the display, watching the Ashford Vale bank sharply away from the colony, drawing all 4 cruisers' fire with it, and understood in that moment that Whitfield was not simply fighting to survive. He was actively managing the battlefield, thinking several steps ahead, ensuring that the bombardment currently threatening what remained of the Doran settlements would stop entirely, as the Corvette forces redirected their full attention toward the single ship that had just dismantled a third of their fleet in under 5 minutes. It worked exactly as he had planned. The bombardment of the colony ceased entirely, as every remaining Corvette vessel, including the 2 heavy warships that had been holding position in high orbit, began converging on the Ashford Vale's position instead. I realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the bridge, that Captain Whitfield had used himself, deliberately, as the single point of focus for an entire hostile fleet, in order to protect civilians he had never met, on a planet he had no formal obligation to defend.
He drew all of them, Bora Wren said, disbelief evident in every word.
All of them, onto one ship. Yes, I said quietly, watching the display as 6 remaining warships, 4 cruisers, and 2 heavy bombardment vessels converged from multiple directions on a single human vessel that had, only minutes earlier, dismantled 9 attack craft without sustaining any apparent damage. I did not know, in that moment, whether what I was witnessing was courage, of a kind I had never encountered in any species I had studied, or something closer to certainty so absolute that fear simply did not factor into the equation at all. What I did know was that everything I believed about how conflicts were supposed to unfold, about the necessity of caution, consensus, and measured response, was being quietly dismantled in front of me, one impossible maneuver at a time. The Halvanar continued its approach, still minutes away, and all any of us could do was watch as the true test of what a single human ship was capable of finally began. The 6 remaining Corvette warships closed on the Ashford Vale from every direction, their combined weapons fire lighting up the space around the human vessel in a constant, overlapping barrage. I gripped the edge of my console without realizing I was doing it, unable to look away from the display, even as every instinct told me I was about to witness the death of the one person who had come to help, when no one else had moved quickly enough. Shields at maximum output, Bora Wren called out, reading whatever partial data our sensors could gather from the exchange. His shields are holding. I don't understand how. That much sustained fire should have collapsed any shield configuration we have on record. Captain Kellamar leaned forward, his 4 eyes narrowed at the display. Are we certain of the enemy's total weapons output? Confirm those readings. Confirmed twice, Captain, Bora said. The math does not work. And yet his shields are holding. I watched the display, transfixed, as the Ashford Vale moved through the storm of incoming fire, with a series of maneuvers that seemed to anticipate each attack before it happened. It was positioning itself, again and again, so that each Corvette vessel's own field of fire threatened to overlap with another, forcing them to constantly adjust or risk striking each other. Within the chaos of the engagement, a pattern began to emerge, one that I slowly realized was not chaos at all, but a deliberate strategy, executed with a precision that left no room for improvisation. One of the heavy warships, attempting to break away and reposition for a clear shot, drifted directly into the path of a cruiser's sustained fire meant for the human vessel. The resulting damage crippled the heavy warship's propulsion systems entirely, and it began to drift, powerless, out of the engagement. "Did he do that on purpose?" Priya asked quietly, watching the sequence replay in her mind, as much as on the screen in front of her. "I do not know how anyone could plan something like that," I admitted, though even as I said it, I was beginning to suspect that somehow, impossibly, he had. The remaining 5 corvette vessels adjusted their formation, clearly recognizing the danger of striking one another, and began to spread out, attempting to surround the Ashford Vale from a wider spread of angles. It was, by any tactical standard I understood, a sound adjustment. It should have made the human vessel's position significantly more difficult to defend. Instead, Captain Whitfield's ship altered its own trajectory, accelerating directly toward the gap between 2 of the cruisers, rather than away from the widening formation. For a moment, I believed he intended to attempt an escape, perhaps recognizing that the odds had finally become insurmountable, even for whatever remarkable ship and pilot we were witnessing. I was wrong. As the Ashford Vale passed between the 2 cruisers at what our sensors registered as an alarmingly close distance, it released a rapid series of precisely targeted strikes against both vessels simultaneously, disabling their weapons arrays before continuing through the gap and out the other side. The entire maneuver took less than 8 seconds. Neither cruiser managed to land a single hit during the exchange. "2 more down," Boren said, his voice now carrying something closer to genuine astonishment than disbelief. "Weapons disabled on both, no destruction, no casualties reported on either vessel's remaining life signatures." I found myself doing something I had not expected. I began keeping a mental count, almost involuntarily, of exactly how many ships had been removed from the fight, and how many remained, the way one might count down the final moments of an event whose outcome had already become inevitable, even if the path there remained astonishing to witness. 3 corvette vessels remained combat-capable, 2 cruisers, and the single heavy warship that had not yet been disabled. All 3 redirected their fire toward the Ashford Vale, with what I can only describe as increasing desperation, their coordination breaking down as the earlier confidence of overwhelming numbers evaporated in the face of what they were witnessing. Captain Whitfield's voice came through the open channel again, still steady, still calm, though I noticed for the first time a slight edge of effort in his breathing that suggested even he was not entirely unaffected by what he was doing. "Fleet Command, be advised. Remaining hostiles are attempting to break off and retreat toward the outer system. Recommend you position to intercept if they attempt to flee before I can fully neutralize the engagement." "Understood," Captain Kellamar replied immediately, already issuing orders to adjust our own course, to cut off any potential escape routes. I realized, listening to that brief exchange, that Whitfield was not simply fighting for survival, or even for the protection of the Doran colony below. He was thinking about accountability, about ensuring that whoever had ordered this attack would not simply vanish into the depths of space to attack another undefended population somewhere else in the galaxy. Even in the middle of an engagement against overwhelming odds, he was planning several steps beyond the immediate fight. The final heavy warship, recognizing that retreat was no longer a realistic option with an assembly fleet closing in from one direction and whatever the human vessel represented pressing from the other, made a desperate final push, redirecting all remaining power to its forward weapons array in an attempt to overwhelm the Ashford Vale's shields through sheer concentrated force. For the first time since the engagement began, I saw something on our sensor readout that made my chest tighten with genuine fear. The Ashford Vale's shield strength, which had remained remarkably stable throughout the entire battle, began to fluctuate under the sustained assault, dropping in increments that our systems flagged with increasing urgency. "His shields are failing," Boren said, his voice sharp with alarm. 15%, and dropping. If that warship maintains this rate of fire, he will lose shield integrity within 90 seconds. I opened the channel immediately, unable to stop myself. "Captain Whitfield, your shields are failing. You need to disengage and let our fleet close the remaining distance." There was a brief pause, filled only by the sound of alarms I could faintly hear through the open channel, systems within his own ship, warning him of the same danger our sensors had detected. When he answered, his voice had changed slightly, sharper, more focused, though still without any trace of panic. Negative, Marsh. Disengaging now gives them a window to redirect fire back toward the colony. I'm not giving them that window. I watched, helpless, as the shield percentage continued to drop on our display, and I understood in that moment that Captain Whitfield had made a decision that no tactical manual I had ever studied would have recommended. He was choosing to absorb continued damage, to risk his own ship and his own survival, rather than allow even a brief opportunity for the enemy to threaten the civilians he had come to protect. At 8% shield strength, with alarms undoubtedly blaring throughout his own vessel, the Ashford Vale executed a maneuver that our sensors struggled to fully track, a sharp, almost impossibly tight turn that brought it directly beneath the heavy warship's primary weapons arc, a position from which the larger vessel could no longer bring its forward guns to bear without risking structural damage to its own hull. From that position, in a single, precisely targeted strike, the Ashford Vale disabled the warship's main power core, and the largest vessel in the entire corvette fleet went dark on our sensors, drifting silently, its threat finally neutralized. The bridge of the Halvanar erupted into a stunned, disbelieving silence that lasted several long seconds before anyone spoke. "Confirm status of remaining hostiles," Captain Kellamar finally said, his voice noticeably unsteady for the first time since I had served under his command. "2 cruisers remaining," Bora-Ren reported, checking his readouts twice before continuing, both attempting to retreat at maximum speed. Ashford Vale shield strength currently at 6% and stabilizing. No further weapons fire detected from the human vessel. It appears he has allowed the retreat. I stared at the display, watching the 2 remaining corvette cruisers flee toward the edge of the system, and the single, heavily damaged human vessel that remained motionless near the Doran colony, its shields barely holding, having just single-handedly dismantled a fleet of 18 warships in under 15 minutes. I opened the channel one final time, my voice unsteady, in a way I had not expected. "Captain Whitfield, this is Ellen Marsh. Please confirm your status." The pause before he answered felt longer than it likely was. When his voice finally came through, it carried unmistakable exhaustion, though the calm certainty that had defined every word since our first contact remained unshaken. "Ashford Vale, reporting minor damage, shields depleted, but hull integrity intact. I'm alive, Marsh. Someone should get down to that colony and start pulling people out of the wreckage. I did what I could from up here, but they're going to need real help now." I looked around the bridge at the faces of my crewmates, all of us processing what we had just witnessed, and I understood that nothing about how I viewed the balance of power in this galaxy would ever be quite the same again. The Halvanar finally reached the Varan expanse 22 minutes after the last shots had been fired, and what greeted us on arrival was a scene unlike anything I had encountered in my career. Drifting wreckage from 9 light attack craft, 4 cruisers, and 1 heavy warship spread across a wide stretch of space, their crews alive but stranded, their weapons and propulsion systems methodically disabled beyond any immediate capacity for repair. In the middle of it all, the Ashford Vale sat nearly motionless, its shields still recovering, close enough to the Doran colony that I suspected its presence there had been deliberate, a final measure of protection even after the battle had ended. Captain Kellamar wasted no time issuing orders. Rescue teams were dispatched to the colony's surface immediately, and separate teams were sent to secure the disabled corvette vessels, ensuring their crews received medical attention, while also taking them into custody for what would undoubtedly become a lengthy assembly investigation. I was assigned to lead the initial contact team that would meet directly with Captain Whitfield, both to assess his condition and to begin the formal process of documenting what had occurred. I boarded a shuttle with Priya and 2 assembly medical officers, and within a few minutes, we were docking with the Ashford Vale. The airlock cycled open, and I stepped aboard a human vessel for the first time in my life, uncertain exactly what to expect after everything I had just witnessed. The interior was smaller than I had anticipated, efficient in its design, every surface serving a clear function without unnecessary ornamentation. Warning lights still blinked across several damaged systems, and the faint smell of overheated components lingered in the recycled air. Captain Whitfield met us near the airlock himself, and I found myself surprised by how ordinary he appeared. A man of average height, dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, dressed in a simple flight uniform that showed signs of the stress his ship had just endured. There was a small cut above his eyebrow, already treated, and a tiredness in his posture that suggested the calm voice I had heard over the comm channel had cost him more than he let on. "Captain Whitfield," I said, extending a hand in the human gesture I had studied, but never actually performed. "Ellen Marsh, Assembly Liaison aboard the Halvanar. On behalf of the Council, I want to formally thank you for your actions here today." He shook my hand, his grip firm but not aggressive, and offered a small, tired smile. "Just Owen is fine, and you don't need to thank me. I just did what needed doing." The medical officers moved past us to begin a more thorough assessment of both the ship's systems and Owen's own physical condition, and I found myself standing in the corridor of his vessel, still processing the scale of what had happened only half an hour earlier. "May I ask you something?" I said, and he nodded, leaning against a bulkhead, as if standing without support had become difficult. "How did you do that? 18 ships, and you disabled nearly all of them, without destroying a single vessel, or ending a single life." "I have studied combat strategy across a dozen species during my career, and I have never seen anything like what you did today." Owen was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same measured seriousness he had shown throughout the engagement. "Where I'm from, we spent a long time fighting wars the hard way," he finally said. "Slow, grinding, terrible things that dragged on for years and cost more than anyone ever wanted to pay. Eventually, we figured out that the fastest way to end a fight is to remove the enemy's ability to keep fighting, not necessarily the enemy themselves. Disable the ships, disable the weapons. Take away their capacity to do harm, and the fight is over, usually before anyone realizes just how outmatched they actually were." "But the risk," I said. "You took an enormous risk, allowing yourself to be surrounded, allowing your shields to nearly fail entirely, all to draw their fire away from the colony." "That's the whole point," Owen said, and for the first time I heard something firmer beneath the tiredness in his voice. "If I hadn't drawn their attention, they would have kept bombarding that colony, the entire time your fleet was still hours away. I had a ship that could take the hit. Those people on the surface didn't have anything at all. That's not really a difficult choice, when you look at it that way. I did not have an immediate response to that. In assembly military doctrine, risk calculations were always framed around probability of mission success, balanced against resource preservation. What Owen described was something else entirely. A willingness to absorb personal risk, specifically because he had determined that his own survival mattered less, in that particular equation, than the survival of people who had no other means of defending themselves. Priya, who had been standing quietly nearby, finally stepped forward, her voice unsteady with emotion she no longer seemed able to contain. "My family is on that colony," she said. "I do not know yet if they survived, but because of what you did, at least they have a chance. I do not know how to properly thank someone for that." Owen's expression softened considerably, the tiredness in his eyes giving way to something gentler. "I hope they made it," he said simply. "That's really all I was trying to do." Over the following hours, as rescue operations continued on the surface, and the assembly began the slow process of taking the captured Corvette vessels into custody, I remained aboard the Ashford Vale, partly to complete my official assessment, and partly, I admit, because I found myself unable to look away from the quiet, unassuming manner in which Owen Whitfield conducted himself. There was no pride in his bearing, no satisfaction at having single-handedly dismantled an enemy fleet. If anything, he seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention his actions had generated, deflecting praise whenever it was offered, and redirecting every conversation toward the well-being of the colony below. Reports began arriving steadily throughout the afternoon. Rescue teams had located survivors in 3 separate underground shelters, badly shaken, but largely uninjured thanks to the early warning that had allowed most residents to take cover before the worst of the bombardment began. Casualties, while not entirely absent, were far fewer than the initial damage assessments had suggested might occur, a fact that every medical officer involved attributed directly to how quickly the bombardment had ceased once Owen's ship arrived and drew the entire Corvette fleet's attention. Priya received word late in the afternoon that her family had indeed survived, sheltering in one of the underground facilities throughout the entire engagement. I watched her step away to a quiet corner of the corridor, and allow herself to cry openly, for the first time since the crisis began. And I felt something shift within myself as I witnessed it, a growing understanding of exactly how much had been saved that day by a single decision made 11 minutes after a distress call, by someone who had never met the people he chose to protect. Captain Kellamar came aboard personally in the early evening, along with 2 senior officers from Assembly Command who had been dispatched to begin the formal investigation into the Corvette attack. I watched as Owen answered their questions with the same calm patience he had shown throughout, providing detailed tactical data from his ship's systems that would prove invaluable in building the Assembly's case against the Corvette Dominion's leadership. At one point, one of the senior officers, a stern Vasari administrator named Torvin Ash, asked Owen directly why he had chosen to act alone, rather than waiting for a coordinated Assembly response. Owen considered the question carefully before answering. "Because waiting costs lives," he said. "I understand the value of coordination, of careful process, of making sure decisions are made with full information and proper authority. I really do. But there's a difference between being careful and being slow when someone is actively dying because help hasn't arrived yet. I made a judgment call. I'd make the same one again." Torvin Ash did not respond immediately, and I could see in his expression the same internal conflict I had been wrestling with since the engagement began, the difficulty of reconciling deeply held institutional values with the undeniable outcome of a single individual choosing to act outside them. As the evening wore on, and the immediate crisis gave way to the slower work of investigation and recovery, I found myself reflecting on everything I had witnessed since that first alarm had sounded on the Halvanar's bridge. I had entered this crisis believing firmly in the value of process, of consensus, of careful deliberation as the surest path toward just outcomes. I still believed those things mattered, but I had also witnessed, with my own eyes, what happened when someone chose immediate, decisive action over that careful process, and I could not deny the lives that decision had saved. I did not yet understand the full implications of what humanity's willingness to act this way might mean for the wider galaxy. I did not yet know how the Assembly Council would respond once the full report of Owen Whitfield's actions reached them, or how other species across known space would react to learning that a single human ship had accomplished what an entire coordinated fleet response might have taken hours to achieve, if it could have achieved it at all. But standing in the corridor of the Ashford Vale that evening, watching Owen quietly help coordinate the ongoing rescue efforts on the surface below, I understood that something fundamental had changed. The galaxy had just witnessed, for the first time in a very public and undeniable way, exactly what humanity was capable of when they decided that someone needed help and chose not to wait. 3 days after the engagement in the Varan Expanse, I received orders to return to Assembly Central, along with the full data package documenting everything that had occurred, including sensor logs from the Halvanar, testimony from surviving Doran colonists, and, most significantly, the complete tactical record recovered from the Ashford Vale itself, which Owen had voluntarily shared in full with Assembly investigators. The journey back gave me time to think, more time than I had allowed myself during the chaos of the previous days. I reviewed the footage repeatedly during that journey, not because I doubted what I had witnessed, but because I found myself trying to understand it more deeply, trying to reconcile the calm, almost gentle demeanor of the man I had met aboard that ship with the devastating efficiency he had displayed during the battle itself. What struck me most, watching the footage again and again, was the complete absence of unnecessary destruction. 18 ships engaged, and not a single one destroyed. Not a single confirmed loss of life among the Corvette crews, despite the overwhelming tactical advantage Owen had held throughout the majority of the engagement. Every strike had been calculated specifically to disable rather than eliminate, a level of precision and restraint that seemed almost more remarkable to me than the raw combat capability itself. Priya traveled with me for part of the journey, having been temporarily reassigned to assist with translation duties for the ongoing investigation, before returning to be with her family. We spoke often during those quiet hours, and I found her perspective, as someone whose life had been directly saved by what Owen had done, invaluable in helping me process the wider implications of what we had witnessed. "Do you think this is normal for them?" she asked me once, as we reviewed additional background material on human military history that had been compiled for the investigation. Is this how humans typically respond to crises like this? I did not have a confident answer at the time, though the historical records we reviewed together suggested a pattern that ran deeper than a single captain's individual choices. Human military doctrine, as far as the Assembly's limited understanding extended, had shifted dramatically over the past century of their own history, moving away from prolonged attritional conflicts toward strategies specifically designed to minimize the duration and total cost of any engagement, even when that meant accepting significant individual risk in the short term. I think, I finally said, that what we witnessed was not an anomaly. I think it may simply be how they have learned to approach conflict, as a species, quickly, decisively, with as little unnecessary harm as possible, but without hesitation once a decision has been made. Priya considered this for a long moment. That is a strange kind of comfort, she said, knowing that if something like this happens again, somewhere else, to some other people who have no one to protect them, there might be someone willing to do exactly what he did. When we arrived at Assembly Central, the atmosphere within the council chambers was unlike anything I had experienced during my years of service. Word of the Varen Expanse engagement had spread quickly through diplomatic channels, and delegates from dozens of member species had already begun requesting formal briefings before the official investigation had even concluded. I was called to testify before a joint session of the Security and Diplomatic Committees within my first day back, and I found myself standing before a chamber filled with representatives from every corner of assembly space, all of them waiting to hear a first-hand account of what had transpired. I presented the facts as clearly and objectively as I could, walking the assembled delegates through the timeline of events, from the initial distress call to the final disabling of the Corvette heavy warship. I described Owen's decision to act without authorization, his tactical approach that prioritized disabling rather than destroying enemy vessels, and the ultimate outcome that had saved the vast majority of the Doran colony's population from what would otherwise have been near total destruction. The questions that followed revealed the deep divide already forming among the delegates. Some pressed me on the dangers of allowing unilateral military action to go unaddressed, worried that Owen's example might encourage other individuals or species to bypass established assembly procedures whenever they judged a crisis urgent enough to warrant it. Others focused on the outcome itself, questioning whether the Assembly's traditional emphasis on caution and consensus had, in this instance, nearly cost an entire civilian population their lives, and whether that traditional approach needed serious reconsideration. A Vasari delegate named Corin Dathe, senior member of the Security Committee, pressed me particularly hard on what she viewed as the central danger of the situation. Liaison Marsh, you are describing a scenario in which a single individual, acting entirely outside Assembly authority, engaged in a significant military action against a hostile force, disabling nearly 24 vessels through means we do not fully understand or have the capability to replicate. Does this not concern you, as someone who has dedicated their career to the principle of collective, deliberated action? I considered the question carefully before answering, aware that my response would likely be recorded and referenced extensively in the weeks to come. It concerns me in the sense that I do not fully understand the extent of human capability, and that uncertainty is inherently difficult for any institution built on careful assessment and consensus, I said. But I would ask the committee to also consider what the outcome would have been had Captain Whitfield waited for authorization, as our own processes would have required. Based on the rate of destruction documented in the early moments of the attack, it is highly likely that the Doran colony would have suffered catastrophic, possibly irreversible losses before any assembly response could have arrived. I do not believe caution and consensus are without value. I believe, in this specific instance, they would have cost lives that were instead saved. The chamber grew quiet following that response, and I could see, even among delegates who had expressed the strongest reservations, a recognition of the uncomfortable truth embedded in what I had said. The Assembly's traditional processes, designed over centuries to prevent hasty and potentially catastrophic decisions, had also, in this instance, proven simply too slow to protect the people they were meant to serve. Over the following weeks, the investigation into the Corvette Dominion expanded significantly, drawing on the extensive intelligence gathered from the captured vessels and their crews. It became clear that the attack on the Doran colony had not been an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of aggression against smaller, unprotected populations across several unclaimed systems, conducted specifically because the Corvette leadership believed such targets fell outside the Assembly's practical capacity to respond in time to matter. The successful defense of the Doran colony and the subsequent capture of a significant portion of their military assets dealt a substantial blow to that strategy, forcing the Corvette Dominion into a period of retreat and reassessment that Assembly analysts believed would take years to fully recover from. Owen himself remained largely out of the public discussions during this period, having returned to routine independent operations along the fringes of Assembly space, where he had apparently spent much of his time since being granted provisional status as an independent operator following humanity's induction into the Assembly. I attempted to reach him once during this period, curious whether he had been following the growing debate his actions had sparked within the council chambers, and he responded with characteristic brevity, expressing gratitude for the update, but showing little interest in the political dimensions of what had occurred. His only stated concern remained the continued well-being of the Doran colonists, and he asked that any resources the Assembly could spare be directed toward their ongoing recovery rather than toward further discussion of his own role in the events. It was during this period that I first began to hear the phrase that would eventually spread throughout every level of Assembly discourse, whispered initially among junior diplomatic staff, and gradually adopted even by senior delegates during formal sessions. Humans do not fight wars. They end them. It captured something that I had struggled to articulate clearly during my own testimony, a recognition that humanity's approach to conflict, whatever its origins, represented something fundamentally different from anything the Assembly had encountered in any of its other member species. Not aggression for its own sake, not the slow, grinding attrition that had defined so many historical conflicts between rival powers. Something faster, more decisive, and in its own strange way, more merciful than anything the Assembly's careful, consensus-driven processes had ever produced. I did not yet know how the wider galaxy would ultimately respond to that realization, whether it would inspire trust, fear, or some uneasy combination of both, but I understood, returning to my quarters after another long day of testimony and debate, that the galaxy I had known before the Varan Expanse crisis, and the galaxy I now found myself living in, were no longer quite the same place. 6 weeks after the Varan Expanse crisis, the Assembly Council convened a full plenary session to formally address the growing debates surrounding humanity's role within Assembly space. I was asked to attend as a resource witness, available to answer any additional questions the delegates might raise, and I found myself seated in the observation gallery, watching representatives from over 60 member species argue over what humanity's actions meant for the future of galactic security. The session opened with a formal presentation from the Security Committee, led by Corin Daith, outlining a proposal that would establish stricter oversight of independent human military operations, requiring any human vessel operating near Assembly space to file detailed operational plans and obtain preliminary authorization before engaging in any activity that could be classified as a military action, even in response to an active crisis. The proposal was, on its surface, a reasonable extension of existing Assembly protocols, designed to bring humanity's independent operators more fully within the established framework that governed every other member species. But as the debate unfolded over the following hours, it became clear that the underlying motivation extended well beyond simple procedural consistency. A delegate from the Thren Collective, a species known for their methodical, deeply cautious approach to governance, spoke at length about what he described as an unacceptable level of unpredictability now associated with human capability. We have seen, in a single engagement, a demonstration of tactical capability that exceeds anything our own combined forces could have produced, he said. I do not question the outcome in this specific instance. The Doran colony was saved, and for that we are grateful. But we cannot build a stable galactic order around the assumption that individual actors, however well-intentioned, will always choose to act with such restraint. What happens the day a human captain, facing a similarly overwhelming crisis, does not choose restraint? The chamber murmured with a mixture of agreement and unease at this framing, and I watched several delegates who had previously expressed admiration for Owen's actions shift visibly in their seats, clearly grappling with the discomfort embedded in the question. A Doran representative, one of the colony's own elected officials who had traveled to Assembly Central, specifically to address the council, rose to speak next, and the chamber fell into a respectful silence as she began. "My name is Talus Wren, and I speak on behalf of the Doran colony that was attacked 6 weeks ago," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the evident weight of emotion behind her words. "I have listened to this debate for several hours now, and I understand the concerns being raised. I understand that unpredictability is difficult for an institution built on careful process, but I would ask every delegate in this chamber to consider what would have happened to my people had that unpredictability not existed. We are not a member species. We had no formal claim to assembly protection. Under the very protocols this committee is now debating, we would likely still have been waiting for authorization when the last of our settlements fell silent." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the chamber, before continuing. "I am not here to tell this council how to structure its relationship with humanity. That is not my place. I am here to tell you that my children are alive today because someone decided that waiting was not an option. Whatever framework you build going forward, I would ask that you not build it in a way that makes what happened to us less likely to happen for the next people in danger, simply because it made your institution feel more comfortable." The chamber remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, and I found myself deeply moved by the simple, unadorned honesty of her testimony, delivered without exaggeration or appeal to emotion beyond the plain truth of what her people had experienced. The debate continued for the remainder of that session, and well into the following day, delegates weighing the legitimate concerns raised by the Security Committee against the undeniable outcome that Talus Wren had described so plainly. I listened as proposals were floated and reconsidered, as compromises were suggested and debated, and as it slowly became clear that no simple resolution would fully satisfy every perspective represented within that chamber. Eventually, a modified framework emerged, one that stopped well short of the restrictive oversight originally proposed by the Security Committee. Rather than requiring prior authorization for independent human operations, the Assembly instead established an expanded rapid response protocol, one that formally recognized the value of decisive independent action in genuine emergency situations, while also creating clearer channels for coordination and information sharing between human operators and Assembly fleets, whenever circumstances allowed for it. It was not a perfect solution, and I suspect no delegate in that chamber believed it fully resolved the deeper questions Owen's actions had raised about the balance between institutional caution and individual initiative. But it represented an honest attempt to preserve what had clearly worked, the speed and decisiveness of humanity's response to crisis, while still building meaningful structures of accountability around it. During a brief recess following the vote, I found myself approached by Torvin Ash, the senior Visari administrator, who had questioned Owen so directly aboard the Ashford Vale following the engagement. He seemed thoughtful, less rigid in his bearing than I remembered from our previous encounters. "You testified strongly in favor of the outcome, Liaison Marsh," he said. "I imagine that was not an easy position to defend, given your background." "It was not," I admitted. "I have spent my career believing deeply in the value of the process I serve. Watching that process nearly fail so completely was difficult to reconcile." Torvin nodded slowly. "I confess, I remain uncertain about the broader implications of what we witnessed. A species capable of that level of decisive force is not something any careful administrator can simply dismiss as harmless, regardless of how restrained their conduct was in this particular instance." "I understand that concern," I said, "but I would offer a different perspective, if you are willing to hear it." He gestured for me to continue. "I have reviewed the tactical footage of that engagement more times than I can easily count," I said. 18 ships, and not a single life lost, despite an overwhelming tactical advantage that would have allowed for far more destructive outcomes had that been the goal. I do not believe that restraint was incidental. I believe it reflects something intentional about how humanity has learned to approach conflict, a genuine effort to end fighting as quickly and with as little permanent harm as possible, even when circumstances would easily justify a much harsher response. That is not the behavior of a species we should fear, Administrator Ash. It is, I believe, the behavior of a species we should be grateful chose to stand with us rather than against us." Torvin considered this for a long moment before offering a small, thoughtful nod. "Perhaps you are right, Liaison Marsh. Time will tell, I suppose, whether that restraint holds under circumstances less favorable than the ones we witnessed at Varen." As the session resumed and the council moved on to other matters, I found myself reflecting on how quickly the language surrounding humanity's role within the assembly had shifted over the preceding weeks. What had begun as fear and uncertainty had gradually given way to something more complex, a grudging respect intertwined with a persistent, unresolved wariness that I suspected would continue to color the assembly's relationship with humanity for a very long time to come. The phrase that had first emerged among junior staff in the days following the Varan Expanse crisis had by now become a fixture of formal diplomatic discourse, spoken openly even by senior delegates who had initially resisted its implications.
Humans do not fight wars.
They end them. It was no longer simply an observation. It had become, in the span of 6 short weeks, something closer to an accepted truth, that every species within assembly space would now have to factor into their understanding of the galaxy's true balance of power. Nearly a year has passed since the Varan Expanse crisis, and I find myself, on quiet evenings aboard whatever vessel I am currently assigned to, still thinking often about everything that unfolded during those few extraordinary days. I remained with the Assembly's diplomatic corps, though my responsibilities shifted significantly in the aftermath of that event, as I was gradually drawn into an expanded role, coordinating communication between Assembly Command and the growing number of independent human operators, now conducting rapid response missions along the frontier regions of known space. The Doran colony has rebuilt in the time since the attack, slowly but steadily, and Talis Ren was eventually elected to a permanent advisory position within the Assembly, representing unaffiliated populations whose interests had previously received far less consideration than they deserved. I like to think that some part of the recognition she now receives traces back to the honesty of her testimony that day, and to the willingness of enough delegates to truly listen to what she had to say. Owen Whitfield, as far as I have been able to follow, has continued much as he did before that day, quietly responding to crises across the frontier whenever they arise, rarely seeking recognition, and generally avoiding the growing attention his actions at Varan brought to his name throughout assembly space. I have spoken with him occasionally since then, brief exchanges mostly related to coordination on subsequent missions, and he remains exactly as unassuming as he was the first day I met him aboard his ship, still more concerned with the well-being of whoever he has just helped than with any acknowledgement of what that help required of him. What has changed most significantly, in the time since Varan, is not any single policy or protocol, though several have indeed been adjusted in the ways I described. What has changed is something harder to define precisely, a shift in how the Assembly, and the many species who call it home, now understand humanity's presence among us. I have sat in on countless briefings and discussions over the past year, listening to delegates from a dozen different worlds try to articulate exactly what it means to share the galaxy with a species capable of what we witnessed that day, and I do not believe any of us has fully arrived at a settled answer. There is fear, certainly, and I do not believe that fear is entirely unwarranted. A species capable of ending a battle of that scale in a matter of minutes, with such overwhelming precision, is not something any reasonable observer could regard as harmless. I have heard delegates speak in hushed tones about what might happen should humanity ever turn that same capability toward ends less noble than the rescue of an endangered colony, and I do not dismiss those concerns as unfounded paranoia. They are legitimate questions that deserve continued attention, continued dialogue, and continued careful observation as humanity's relationship with the wider assembly continues to evolve. But alongside that fear, I have also witnessed something else growing steadily throughout the past year, something that I believe matters just as much in the long run. Trust. Not blind trust, not the kind that ignores legitimate concerns in favor of convenient comfort, but a hard-earned trust, built on repeated demonstrations that humanity's remarkable capability for decisive action has, again and again, been directed toward protecting the vulnerable, rather than exploiting them. In the months since Varan, human vessels have responded to no fewer than 11 separate crises across the frontier regions, each time with the same combination of speed, precision, and restraint that first defined Owen Whitfield's actions at the Doran colony. Not every engagement has ended as cleanly or as successfully. There have been losses, difficult moments, situations where the outcome fell short of what anyone would have hoped for. But the pattern has held remarkably consistent, and slowly, cautiously, the wider assembly has begun to adjust its understanding accordingly. I think often about the phrase that emerged in the immediate aftermath of that first crisis, the one that has since become so deeply woven into how the assembly discusses humanity's role among us. Humans do not fight wars, they end them. I understand now, in a way I did not fully grasp during those first chaotic days, that this phrase captures something true not just about humanity's tactical capability, but about a deeper philosophy that seems to guide how they choose to engage with conflict in general. Not eagerness for battle, not glory sought through prolonged struggle, simply a clear-eyed determination to bring suffering to its swiftest possible end, whatever that requires of the person willing to answer the call. I do not know what the coming years will bring, as humanity's presence within the assembly continues to grow, and as more species across known space come to understand exactly what that presence means for the balance of power in this galaxy. I suspect the debates I witnessed during that plenary session will continue, in various forms, for a very long time, as institutions built on caution and consensus continue to grapple with a species that operates according to a fundamentally different philosophy of engagement. But I know this much for certain, based on everything I witnessed with my own eyes during those extraordinary days at Varen. When the alarm sounds, when innocent people find themselves facing a threat no one else has arrived in time to answer, there is now a reasonable chance that somewhere, not too far away, a single ship will already be changing course, moving toward that danger, rather than away from it, guided by a captain who has already decided that waiting is not an option worth considering. That knowledge, more than any policy or protocol the Assembly Council has since adopted, is what I carry with me now. Each time I take my post aboard whatever vessel I find myself serving, the galaxy remains a vast, uncertain, sometimes dangerous place, filled with threats both old and new. But it is, I have come to believe, a somewhat safer place than it was before that single human warship arrived at the edge of the Varen expanse, uninvited, unsanctioned, and utterly unwilling to wait. And for all the uncertainty that still surrounds exactly what that means for the future of this galaxy, I find, on my quietest evenings, that I am deeply grateful it arrived when it did.